The law of one price says that if you have two similar markets that are fully connected, a single price is going to emerge across those two markets in equilibrium. We saw that in our example of corn in North Carolina and Iowa, where it was relatively easy to ship corn from one place to the other, and that caused prices to fully converge between the two regions. But the law of one price is going to hold only to the extent to which there are no what we call compensating differentials. Let's think, for example, about the market for natural gas. Now, it turns out that if the European market were fully disconnected from the US market, the equilibrium price in Europe would be much higher than it would be in the US. And that's because natural gas is abundant in the US, but not in Europe. So the law of one price would suggest that there'll be people who see an opportunity to buy low and sell high, to arbitrage. And as they do that, demand will shift out in the US, causing upward pressure on price in the US, and supply will shift out in Europe, putting downward pressure on price in Europe. But it turns out that natural gas, unlike corn, is not that easy to ship, especially across oceans. You have to first liquefy it, which is an expensive process. Then you have to put it on specially equipped tankers in specially equipped ports, ship it across the ocean to other specially equipped ports, where the natural gas can be deliquefied, put into pipelines, and then pumped to its final destination. Now that involves significant costs per unit of natural gas that's being shipped. This doesn't mean that there won't be any shipment of natural gas from the US to Europe. If the price difference is sufficiently large to overcome that per unit transport cost, then in fact we will see natural gas bought in the US and shipped to Europe. So that will put upward pressure on price in the US and downward pressure on price in Europe. But we wouldn't expect prices to fully converge, because at some point prices will have fallen to a certain point in Europe and risen to a certain point in the US, and the difference in those prices, this vertical distance, will be exactly equal to the per unit transport cost of natural gas. At that point, the incentive to buy low and sell high disappears, because now if you buy at this price, ship to Europe, pay the transportation cost, and then sell, you're not making any money anymore. So we've reached an equilibrium where there are different prices in Europe and in the US. And the difference in prices is exactly equal to the per unit transport cost, which compensates those who ship the natural gas from the US to Europe for that cost. That's why we call it a compensating differential. It compensates those who transport the natural gas for the costs that they incur in doing so. And once that price difference has been reached, we see a new equilibrium, but now with different prices across the two regions. We can think of other types of compensating differentials. Suppose, for example, that Europe imposed a tax on imports from the US. That tax would be just like a per unit transport cost. Every time you unload one of the units of natural gas in Europe from the ship, you not only had to pay for the transport cost, but now you also have to pay a tax. That tax would add to what has to be compensated for that shipping to continue. And in that case, the prices would not converge this much, they would stop converging earlier. That would be an additional compensating differential. But we also don't see compensating differentials just in output markets. We can also see them in input markets. Let's think, for example, about the market for a particular type of labor, the kind of labor that has high math skills. And suppose that people with high math skills have two choices. They can either become actuaries or they can become teachers, math teachers. So now we have two labor markets that draw on the same labor pool, people who are skilled in math. So we would have labor on this axis, the price of labor, wage on this axis. And similarly, for math teachers, we'd have labor and the wage. Now suppose the law of one price holds. That would mean that people have selected into these two markets until the wage is equalized across those two markets. Demand and supply for actuaries crosses at the same wage as it does for math teachers. So now a single price, a single wage emerges across those two markets. But now suppose that the life of an actuary is actually quite different than the life of a math teacher. Suppose that being an actuary is pretty isolated, it's pretty boring, whereas being a math teacher, you get to impact the lives of children, feel like you're doing something important in the world. So there's a kind of satisfaction that comes from being a math teacher that doesn't come from being an actuary. If that's the case, and we had a single wage across those two markets, we would not be in equilibrium. Actuaries would look at math teachers and say, gee, they're making the same wage we are, but they have a more satisfying life. So I should switch from being an actuary to being a teacher. Now, as that happens, which curves are going to shift in these two pictures? Well, actuaries supply labor in the actuary market. If they shift out of that market, then they're shifting the supply curve to the left. And that puts upward pressure on wages in the market for actuaries. And once they enter the teacher market, they're going to shift the supply of teachers to the right. That puts downward pressure on wages in the teacher market. And that's going to continue as long as actuaries look at math teachers and think that they have a better life, even though they're making lower wages now. Once the last switcher from being an actuary to a math teacher is roughly indifferent between the two professions, then we've reached an equilibrium. Then we've reached a point where no one wants to change what they're doing. So at some point, we'll see the supply of math teachers have shifted sufficiently far to the left, and the supply, to the right, and the supply of actuaries sufficiently to the left, so that the difference in wages between the two, so this vertical distance that emerges, exactly compensates for the better life that math teachers have relative to actuaries. So we have another compensating differential, only this time we call this a compensating wage differential. So even though the two professions draw on the same pool of labor, different wages emerge in equilibrium to compensate for the different quality of life that those two professions offer. And we see that often in labor markets where the workers are similar, but the jobs have different characteristics. So we can see compensating differentials interfere with the law of one price. Different prices emerge across similar markets, not because people aren't moving across those markets or goods aren't being shipped across those markets, but because there's something that needs to be compensated in the process and therefore causes differences in prices in equilibrium.